When the golden locket disappeared from the estate's vault, no one suspected the grieving daughter-in-law. But security cameras don't lie, and neither do family secrets buried for decades. What starts as a simple case of missing jewelry unravels into a web of betrayal, hidden wills, and a truth so shocking it could destroy the prestigious Ashworth family forever. Sometimes the most trusted family members harbor the darkest secrets. The morning mist clung to Ashworth Manor like a shroud, its Gothic towers piercing the gray Yorkshire sky, as if reaching for secrets best left buried. Helena Ashworth stood at the kitchen window, her fingers trembling around a bone china teacup that had belonged to 5 generations of the family. The weight of the porcelain felt heavier today, much like everything else in this sprawling estate that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. 6 months had passed since Duchess Margaret Ashworth drew her final breath in the master bedroom upstairs. And still Helena could feel the old woman's piercing blue eyes watching her from every oil painting that lined the mahogany corridors. The Duchess had ruled this family with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves, and her death had left a vacuum that no one seemed capable of filling. Helena's husband, Charles, had inherited the title and the estate, but not the backbone his mother had possessed. He spent his days locked in the study, drowning in ledgers and legal documents, trying to make sense of a fortune that seemed to be slipping through their fingers like sand. The funeral expenses alone had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and the estate taxes loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. "Mrs. Helena, the solicitor, is here," announced Mrs. Patterson, the elderly housekeeper whose family had served the Ashworths for 3 generations. Her voice carried the weight of disapproval it had held ever since Helena married into the family 15 years ago. To Mrs. Patterson, Helena would always be the girl from the village who had somehow ensnared the heir to one of England's oldest noble families. Helena nodded, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. She smoothed her black wool dress and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. At 42, she still possessed the beauty that had caught Charles's eye at a country fair so many years ago, but grief and financial worry had carved fine lines around her green eyes. Her auburn hair, once her pride, was now pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her years. The solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, waited in the morning room with his leather briefcase and his practiced expression of sympathy. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who had handled the Ashworth family's legal affairs for nearly 3 decades. Helena had never liked him, sensing something predatory in the way he watched the family's struggles with barely concealed interest. "Mrs. Ashworth," he greeted her with a slight bow. "I trust you're coping as well as can be expected during these difficult times." Helena took her seat across from him, noting how he had positioned himself with his back to the portrait of the first Duke of Ashworth. It was a subtle power play, claiming dominance over the room's ancestral authority. "What can I do for you, Mr. Comite, Pemberton?" "It's actually what I can do for you, my dear lady." He opened his briefcase with theatrical precision. "I've been reviewing the Duchess's personal effects inventory, and there seems to be a discrepancy." A cold knot formed in Helena's stomach. "What sort of discrepancy?" "Several items of jewelry are missing from the vault. Quite valuable pieces, I'm afraid. The golden locket with the family crest, for instance, and the emerald brooch that belonged to the 3rd Duchess. The insurance company is naturally concerned." Helena forced her expression to remain neutral, though her heart began to race. Perhaps they were moved for cleaning or appraisal. "That's what I initially thought as well. However, I've checked with all the usual establishments, and no one has any record of receiving these pieces." Pemberton leaned forward slightly. "The insurance company has insisted on a thorough investigation. They'll be sending an assessor next week." The weight of his words settled over Helena like a lead blanket. She knew exactly where those pieces were, hidden in a safety deposit box in London that Charles knew nothing about. What Pemberton didn't know was that she had discovered something far more valuable than jewelry in the Duchess's private papers. Something that could change everything if she had the courage to use it. "Of course, we'll cooperate fully with any investigation," Helena said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. After Pemberton left, Helena walked through the manor's empty corridors, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were watching and judging. She paused at the portrait gallery, where generations of Ashworth ancestors gazed down with expressions ranging from benevolent to stern. Her attention was drawn to a newer addition to the collection, a photograph of Charles and herself on their wedding day. They looked so young and hopeful, standing in the same morning room where she had just met with Pemberton. Charles had promised her a fairy tale life, and for a while, it had seemed possible. But fairy tales, Helena had learned, often contained dark truths hidden beneath their glittering surfaces. The Duchess had never approved of their marriage, making no secret of her belief that Helena was a fortune hunter who had seduced her son away from more suitable prospects. For 15 years, Helena had endured the woman's passive-aggressive comments and deliberate slights, always maintaining the perfect facade of the dutiful daughter-in-law. It wasn't until the Duchess's final weeks, when morphine had loosened her tongue and lowered her guard, that Helena learned the truth about the family she had married into. The revelations had been shocking enough to make her reconsider everything she thought she knew about the Ashworths and her place among them. Helena climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, her hand trailing along the carved banister that had been polished by countless servants over the centuries. She could hear Charles moving around in his study, probably pouring himself another whiskey despite the early hour. He had been drinking more since his mother's death, using alcohol to numb the overwhelming responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. At the end of the corridor stood the Duchess's former bedroom, its door still locked, as if preserving a shrine to the formidable woman who had ruled their lives for so long. Hala had a key, of course, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to enter the room since the funeral. Too many memories lingered there, both beautiful and terrible. Instead, she turned toward her own bedroom, seeking the privacy she needed to make a decision that could alter the course of her life. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her dressing table was a manila envelope containing photocopies of documents she had discovered in the Duchess's personal safe. The originals were safely stored in her London safety deposit box alongside the jewelry. Helena spread the papers across her bed, studying them for what felt like the 100th time. Bank statements showing regular payments to a woman named Sarah Mitchell. Private investigator reports detailing surveillance of various family members. Most shocking of all, a DNA test result that proved Charles was not the biological son of the late Duke. The implications were staggering. If Charles was illegitimate, he had no legal claim to the title or the estate. Everything would pass to his younger brother Edmund, who lived quietly in Scotland and had no idea of his true inheritance. The Duchess had spent decades covering up her affair, paying off potential witnesses, and ensuring that her secret died with her. But Helena had found the truth, and now she held the power to expose it or bury it forever. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Helena, are you in there?" Charles's voice was slightly slurred, confirming her suspicions about the whiskey. Quickly, Helena gathered the papers and returned them to their hiding place. "Coming, darling." She opened the door to find her husband leaning against the frame, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His dark hair, which she had once loved to run her fingers through, was unkempt, and his shirt was wrinkled. The stress of the past 6 months had aged him considerably. "Pemberton stopped by," she said carefully. "There's some question about missing jewelry from your mother's collection." Charles rubbed his temples wearily. "More problems we can't afford to deal with. The estate manager wants to sell the London house, and the accountant is talking about laying off half the staff. Mother would be horrified if she could see what we've become." Helena felt a stab of guilt as she looked at her husband's defeated expression. She had genuinely loved him once, had been thrilled to be swept away from her ordinary life into a world of privilege and prestige. But 15 years of living under the Duchess's thumb had worn away much of that romantic idealism. "We'll figure it out," she said, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We always do." But even as she spoke the words, Helena knew that she was the only one who truly had the power to solve their problems. The question was whether she had the courage to use it, and what price she would be willing to pay for their survival. As evening fell over Ashworth Manor, Helena stood once again at her bedroom window, watching the lights come on in the village below. Somewhere down there was the cottage where she had grown up, where her parents had raised her to be honest and hard-working. They would be ashamed to know what their daughter had become, what she was capable of doing to protect the life she had built. But survival, Helena had learned, sometimes required making choices that couldn't be undone. and as she thought about the papers hidden beneath her floor and the jewelry locked away in London, she began to formulate a plan that would either save her family or destroy it completely. The game was about to begin, and Helena intended to win. Document 2. 3 days after Pemberton's visit, the insurance investigator arrived at Ashworth Manor like a harbinger of doom wrapped in an ill-fitting suit. Detective Inspector Sarah Crawford was not what Helena had expected. Instead of the elderly, distinguished gentleman she had envisioned, Crawford was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of penetrating stare that seemed to see through elaborate facades. Helena watched from the morning room window as Crawford emerged from a modest sedan, her trained gaze already cataloging details about the estate's exterior. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to uncovering secrets, and Helena felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "Mrs. Ashworth," Crawford said when Helena greeted her in the foyer, "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I understand this must be a difficult period for your family. Of course, we want to resolve this matter as quickly as possible." Helena led her to the library, a room she had chosen specifically because its towering shelves of leather-bound books created an atmosphere of respectability and tradition. "Can I offer you tea?" "Thank you, that would be lovely." Crawford settled into one of the wingback chairs, pulling out a digital tablet and a small recording device. "I hope you don't mind if I record our conversation. It helps me keep the facts straight." Helena's mouth went dry, but she nodded graciously. "Certainly." As Mrs. Patterson served tea in the family's finest china, Crawford consulted her notes. "According to the inventory, several pieces of jewelry are missing from the Duchess's collection. Items with significant monetary and historical value. When did you last see these pieces?" "The Duchess rarely wore her jewelry in her final months," Helena replied carefully. "She was too weak, and many of the pieces were quite heavy. I believe the last time I saw her wearing the golden locket was at Christmas dinner nearly 8 months ago, and after her death, who had access to the vault?" "Charles, myself, and Mr. Pemberton, of course. Mrs. Patterson has a key as well for cleaning purposes." Helena paused to sip her tea, using the moment to study Crawford's expression. "Surely you don't suspect the staff?" "I don't suspect anyone at this point, Mrs. Ashworth. I'm simply gathering information." Crawford made several notes on her tablet. "The vault has a security system, I understand?" Helena's heart began to race. She had disabled the cameras on the night she removed the jewelry, but she wasn't certain she had done it correctly. "Yes, though it's quite old. The family has been meaning to upgrade it. I'd like to review the footage from the past 6 months, if that's possible. I'm afraid there may not be much to see. The system has been unreliable lately. Charles mentioned that it wasn't recording properly during his mother's final weeks. The lie came easily, but Helena could see Crawford making another note, probably marking the convenient timing of the system's malfunction. After Crawford left to examine the vault and interview the staff, Helena retreated to her bedroom, her hands shaking as she pulled out her mobile phone. She needed advice, but there was only one person she could trust with the truth about her situation. Her sister Margaret lived in London and worked as a solicitor specializing in family law. They had grown apart over the years, particularly after Helena's marriage elevated her social status far above her humble origins, but Margaret was the only family Helena had left. "Helena?" Margaret's voice was surprised when she answered. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "I need your help," Helena said without preamble. "Legal advice. Hypothetically speaking, if someone discovered evidence that a titled estate was being held illegitimately, what would be the legal ramifications?" There was a long pause. "Helena, what have you gotten yourself into? I can't explain over the phone. Can you meet me in London tomorrow?" "It's urgent," Margaret agreed, though Helena could hear the concern in her voice. That evening, Helena informed Charles that she needed to visit London on family business, carefully avoiding specifics. He barely looked up from his whiskey and the stack of bills that covered his desk. The next morning, Helena took the train to London, the envelope of photocopied documents hidden in her handbag like a loaded weapon. She met Margaret at a small cafe near Lincoln's Inn, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. Margaret looked much the same as always, her brown hair cut in a practical bob and her clothes chosen for functionality rather than fashion. She had inherited their father's no-nonsense personality and their mother's sharp intelligence, making her formidable in the courtroom. "You look terrible," Margaret said bluntly as Helena sat down. "What's this really about?" Helena glanced around to ensure no one could overhear them, then leaned forward. "What do you know about inheritance law regarding illegitimate children?" That's a rather specific question. Margaret's legal mind was already working. Are we talking about someone challenging a will? More complex than that. Helena pulled out one of the photocopied DNA reports, sliding it across the table. What if the heir to a dukedom discovered he was illegitimate and therefore had no legal claim to the title? Margaret studied the document, her expression growing increasingly serious. "Where did you get this?" "The Duchess kept extensive records. I found them after she died." Helena watched her sister's face carefully. The biological father was apparently a stable master who worked on the estate 45 years ago. The Duchess paid him off and sent him away, then convinced her husband the child was premature. Helena, do you understand what you're suggesting? If this is authentic, it would invalidate Charles's entire claim to the dukedom. The title would pass to the next legitimate heir, which would be Edmund, Charles's younger brother. But he has no idea about any of this. Helena retrieved the document and tucked it back into her handbag. The question is, what are my legal obligations? Am I required to disclose this information? Margaret sat back in her chair, clearly struggling with the implications. Legally, you have no obligation to volunteer information that wasn't specifically requested. But morally? Morally, what? The Duchess spent decades protecting this secret. Charles has been the Duke for 6 months. Thousands of people depend on the estate for their livelihoods. Would it be moral to destroy all of that based on something that happened before he was born? But you're essentially perpetrating a fraud. Helena's eyes flashed with anger. Don't lecture me about fraud, Margaret. I've spent 15 years being treated like a second-class citizen in that house. The Duchess made it clear every day that I wasn't good enough for her precious son. Now I discover that her precious son isn't even legitimate, and you think I should nobly sacrifice myself for the sake of truth. That's not what I meant, Margaret said quietly. I'm just trying to understand your options. What exactly are you planning to do? Helena lowered her voice. The estate is drowning in debt. The inheritance taxes alone could force us to sell everything. But if I were to discover additional assets, perhaps some jewelry that had been temporarily removed for safekeeping, you took the missing jewelry. It wasn't a question. I secured certain valuable items to prevent their loss during the estate settlement process, Helena said carefully. Items that could be sold discreetly to help stabilize the family's financial situation. Elena, that's theft. Is it theft if the person I'm taking from has no legal right to those items in the first place? Helena's voice had turned cold. I'm not asking you to participate. I'm asking for legal advice about my options. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her professional obligations and her concern for her sister. If you were to return the jewelry voluntarily before any charges were filed, it would significantly improve your legal position. The insurance company and the police would likely treat it as a misunderstanding rather than a criminal matter. And if I were to anonymously provide information about Edmund's true claim to the title, that would be a separate matter entirely, probably handled through the College of Arms and the House of Lords, depending on how the challenge was presented. Helena nodded, processing this information. She was beginning to see a path forward, though it would require careful timing and considerable risk. After lunch, Helena visited her safety deposit box at a bank in the city. The small room was cramped and windowless, but it contained everything she needed to reshape her family's future. The jewelry lay nestled in velvet-lined boxes, each piece worth more than most people's annual salaries. Beside them were the original documents she had discovered in the Duchess's safe, including the DNA test results and detailed records of the payments made to silence potential witnesses. Helena photographed everything with her phone, creating additional insurance for herself. Then she carefully selected 3 pieces of jewelry, leaving the rest in the safety deposit box. These 3 pieces would be her peace offering to the investigators, evidence of her cooperation and good faith. But the documents would remain her secret weapon, to be used only if her situation became desperate. On the train back to Yorkshire, Helena stared out at the countryside flashing past her window and thought about the woman she had become. The idealistic young girl who had married Charles with dreams of fairy tale romance would be horrified by the calculating person she had evolved into. But that girl had never faced the prospect of losing everything she had worked to build, had never been forced to choose between honor and survival. When she arrived back at Ashworth Manor, she found Charles in the library with Crawford, both of them looking grim. The detective inspector's sharp eyes fixed on Helena immediately, as if she could sense that something had changed. "Mrs. Ashworth," Crawford said, rising from her chair. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to your husband that we've found some interesting discrepancies in the vault's security system." Helena's blood turned to ice, but she forced a smile. "Oh? What sort of discrepancies?" "It appears the system was manually disabled on the night of March 15th, approximately 2 months after the Duchess's death. Someone with knowledge of the security codes accessed the vault at 2:17 a.m. The room seemed to spin around Helena as she realized her mistake. She had assumed the old system wouldn't maintain detailed logs, but apparently it was more sophisticated than she had realized. "How strange," she managed to say. "Charles, do you remember anything unusual happening that night?" Charles shook his head, looking confused and worried. "I was taking sleeping pills during that period. The grief, I wasn't sleeping well." Crawford's gaze remained fixed on Helena. "The timestamp is quite specific. We're hoping the CCTV footage from the corridors might provide additional information about who was moving through the house at that hour." Helena felt the walls closing in around her, but she had one final card to play. "Actually, Detective Inspector, there's something I need to tell you. I've remembered something that might be relevant to your investigation." Both Charles and Crawford looked at her expectantly, and Helena took a deep breath. The game was entering its final phase, and she was about to make the most dangerous move of her life. "I believe I know where some of the missing jewelry might be." Document 3. The silence that followed Helena's declaration was deafening. Charles stared at his wife with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror, while Detective Inspector Crawford leaned forward with the intensity of a predator scenting blood. The library suddenly felt smaller, its walls pressing in as if the weight of centuries-old secrets was finally becoming too much for the ancient stones to bear. "You know where the jewelry is?" Crawford's voice was carefully controlled, but Helena could hear the excitement beneath the professional composure. Helena nodded slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "I think my mother-in-law may have moved some pieces to a secure location before her death. She was particular about family heirlooms. I believe she may have given me some information about where they were stored, but in my grief, I initially dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying woman." Charles looked genuinely bewildered. "Mother never mentioned anything to me about moving jewelry. She spoke to me privately during one of her final nights," Helena continued, weaving truth and fiction together with practiced ease. "She was concerned about the estate taxes and wanted to ensure certain pieces would be protected. I think she may have arranged for temporary storage at a security facility in London." Crawford made detailed notes on her tablet. "What facility? I'll need to check my records." The Duchess was quite specific about the arrangements, but she made me promise not to tell anyone unless it became absolutely necessary. Helena paused, allowing a catch to enter her voice. She was so worried about Charles inheriting a diminished legacy. The reference to his mother's concerns struck Charles visibly. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to the Duchess's impossible standards, and the idea that she had taken secret steps to protect the family's heritage would appeal to his guilt over her death. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Crawford asked. Helena looked appropriately ashamed. "I wasn't certain I was remembering correctly. The Duchess said many things in those final weeks, and not all of it was coherent. I didn't want to send you on a wild goose chase based on what might have been hallucinations brought on by her medication. But now you're more confident in these memories?" "Something you said about the timestamp on the security system triggered a clearer recollection. I believe she may have given me specific instructions about retrieving the items if anything happened to the estate's financial situation." Helena took a shaky breath. She was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Crawford studied Helena's face intently. "I'll need you to contact this storage facility immediately. The insurance company is prepared to involve the police if the items aren't recovered soon." "Of course." I'll make some calls tonight and hopefully have more information for you by tomorrow morning." After Crawford left, Helena found herself alone with Charles for the first time since her return from London. Her husband poured himself a generous whiskey and settled into his chair, looking older than his 45 years. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked quietly. "All these years I thought I knew her so well, but apparently she had an entire network of secrets I was never aware of." Helena felt a stab of genuine sympathy for her husband. If only he knew how extensive his mother's secrets truly were. "She was protecting you, Charles. She always said the burden of the dukedom was heavy enough without adding unnecessary worries. Sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for any of this," Charles admitted, gesturing vaguely at the room around them. The estate, the responsibilities, the constant financial pressure. Mother made it all look so effortless. She had decades of practice, Helena reminded him. And she didn't inherit the estate during a global economic crisis. That evening, Helena called Margaret from the privacy of her bedroom. "I need another favor. Tomorrow I'm going to discover some of the missing jewelry. I need you to help me establish a plausible story about a storage facility." "Helena, this is getting out of hand. You're digging yourself deeper into a hole. I'm managing the situation. Trust me." Helena kept her voice low, conscious that sound carried strangely through the old house. "I've thought this through carefully. I return some of the jewelry, claim I found it in storage per the Duchess's instructions, and the investigation closes. Everyone wins, except for the insurance company who's been paying out claims, and the detective who's been wasting her time on false leads. They'll get their jewelry back. As for the detective, she'll have successfully solved the case. I fail to see the problem." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "What about the other documents? The ones about Charles's legitimacy?" Helena looked toward her hiding place beneath the floorboard. "That information remains my insurance policy. If our financial situation improves, there's no reason it ever needs to see the light of day. And if it doesn't improve, then I'll cross that bridge when I come to it." The next morning, Helena took the early train to London, carrying a small overnight bag that would soon contain the jewelry she intended to discover. She had spent hours rehearsing her story, crafting a narrative that would satisfy Crawford's questions while avoiding any easily disprovable details. The storage facility she had chosen was legitimate, a high-end establishment in Belgravia that catered to wealthy clients who needed secure storage for valuable items. Helena had visited the day before to establish an account and rent a small safety deposit box, creating a paper trail that would support her story. She retrieved the 3 pieces of jewelry from her bank safety deposit box and transferred them to the new facility, then returned to the rental office to speak with the manager. "I'm terribly embarrassed," she told the well-dressed woman behind the mahogany desk. "My mother-in-law arranged storage here for some family jewelry, but I've only just found the paperwork among her effects." The Duchess of Ashworth? She would have made arrangements several months ago. The manager consulted her computer system with the kind of discreet efficiency that expensive establishments prided themselves on. "Ah, yes, here we are. Box 247, registered under the name Margaret Ashworth. We have a note that access was to be granted to immediate family members upon presentation of proper identification and death certificate." Helena produced both documents, along with a healthy tip for the manager's assistance. Within minutes, she was led to the secure storage area and presented with a small metal box containing the jewelry she had placed there less than an hour earlier. "These pieces have been missing from our family collection," Helena said with genuine relief in her voice. "I can't tell you how worried we've been. The Duchess was very specific about the security arrangements," the manager replied smoothly. "She wanted to ensure these items would be safe during the estate transition period." Helena photographed the jewelry in situ, creating evidence of the discovery, then signed the necessary paperwork to remove the items. The entire process took less than 30 minutes, but it provided her with ironclad proof of her story. On the train back to Yorkshire, Helena studied the jewelry pieces that had set this entire drama in motion. The golden locket was a particular favorite of hers, its intricate engraving telling the story of 5 generations of Ashworth women. The emerald brooch had belonged to the 3rd Duchess, a famously beautiful woman who had scandalously eloped with a younger man. The diamond earrings were more recent, a gift from the late Duke to his wife on their silver wedding anniversary. Each piece represented not just monetary value, but centuries of family history and tradition. Helena understood why the Duchess had been so protective of these treasures, and why she had been willing to go to such lengths to preserve them for future generations. But understanding and forgiveness were two different things. Helena could appreciate the Duchess's motivations while still resenting the woman's treatment of her daughter-in-law. 15 years of subtle humiliation and deliberate exclusion had left scars that no amount of posthumous sympathy could heal. When Helena arrived back at Ashworth Manor, she found Crawford waiting in the morning room with barely concealed impatience. The detective had clearly been hoping for a breakthrough in the case, and Helena was about to deliver one. "Detective Inspector, I have wonderful news," Helena announced, setting her bag on the side table with deliberate ceremony. "I was able to locate the storage facility my mother-in-law mentioned. The jewelry is safe." Crawford's eyes widened as Helena carefully removed the pieces from their protective cases, placing them on the polished mahogany table where the morning light could catch their gleaming surfaces. "The Duchess was more organized than any of us realized," Helena continued. "She arranged for secure storage months before her death, but she only told me about it in confidence. I suppose she didn't want to worry Charles with additional details during her final weeks." Crawford photographed each piece extensively, comparing them against the detailed inventory from the insurance file. These matched the descriptions perfectly. "Where exactly were they stored?" Helena provided the name and address of the Belgravia facility, along with copies of the paperwork she had signed. The manager was very helpful. Apparently, the Duchess was quite specific about the security arrangements. "I'll need to verify this information with the facility directly," Crawford said, though her tone had noticeably relaxed. The recovery of the missing jewelry essentially solved her case, leaving only administrative details to be wrapped up. "Of course. I'm just relieved that everything has been resolved." Helena allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The Duchess would have been mortified if these pieces had been permanently lost. Charles arrived as Crawford was preparing to leave, his relief evident when he saw the recovered jewelry spread across the table. "Mother's locket," he said softly, picking up the golden piece with obvious emotion. "She wore this almost every day for as long as I can remember." "Your mother was very wise to protect these items during the estate transition," Crawford observed. "Family heirlooms of this caliber can easily be lost or stolen during periods of uncertainty." After Crawford departed with promises to close the case within the week, Helena and Charles were left alone with the recovered treasures. Charles handled each piece carefully, his fingers tracing the familiar contours as if trying to maintain some connection with his departed mother. "I should have known she would have thought of everything," he said finally. Even dying, she was still protecting this family. Helena watched her husband's reverent handling of the jewelry and felt the familiar mixture of affection and frustration that had characterized their marriage. Charles was a good man, but he was weak in ways that the Duchess had recognized and exploited. He would never have the strength to uncover uncomfortable truths or make difficult decisions, which was both his greatest weakness and, ironically, his greatest asset in their current situation. "The important thing is that they're back where they belong," Helena said, beginning to return the pieces to their cases. "Perhaps we should have them professionally appraised while we're dealing with the estate settlement, for insurance purposes." It was a subtle suggestion, but one that would serve her purposes well. An updated appraisal would establish the current market value of the pieces, information that might prove useful if their financial situation continued to deteriorate. Charles nodded absently, already lost in memories triggered by the familiar weight of his mother's jewelry. He had no idea that his wife had just executed the first phase of a complex plan that could either save their family's legacy or destroy it completely. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the library floor, Helena carefully locked the jewelry away in the estate's vault, noting with satisfaction that the security system dutifully recorded her actions. Everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned, but in the quiet moments before dinner, as she stood in her bedroom looking out over the estate grounds, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The woman she was becoming was someone she barely recognized, someone capable of deception and manipulation, on a scale that would have horrified her younger self. Yet as she thought about the alternative, the prospect of losing everything they had built together, Helena found she could live with the person she had become. The game was far from over, and she still held the most powerful cards, The question now was whether she would have the courage to play them when the time came. Document 4. 2 months after the jewelry's dramatic recovery, Ashworth Manor had settled into an uneasy calm that felt more like the eye of a storm than genuine peace. Helena moved through her daily routines with practiced efficiency, but beneath her composed exterior she was calculating every move like a chess grandmaster planning 20 steps ahead. The insurance case had been closed with commendations for Helena's cooperation and the Duchess's foresight in protecting family heirlooms. Detective Inspector Crawford had even written a brief note expressing her appreciation for Helena's assistance in resolving the matter. On the surface, everything had returned to normal, but the estate's financial crisis continued to deepen like a spreading infection. Charles spent increasingly long hours locked in his study, surrounded by ledgers that painted an ever-darkening picture of their situation. The inheritance taxes were due in 6 weeks, and despite selling several minor properties and dismissing a third of the staff, they were still facing a shortfall of nearly £2 million. Helena watched her husband deteriorate under the pressure, noting how his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and how he had begun taking sleeping pills with increasing frequency. The strong, confident man she had married was slowly dissolving under the weight of responsibilities he was never truly prepared to handle. It was on a particularly gray Tuesday morning that Helena received the phone call that would change everything. "Mrs. Ashworth? This is Dr. Patterson from the Yorkshire General Hospital. I'm calling about your mother-in-law's medical records." Helena felt her blood chill. "I'm sorry. What about her records?" "We've received a request from a genealogy research firm for copies of certain test results from the Duchess's file. Normally, we would require family consent for such releases, but they claim to be working on behalf of a family member. A Mr. Edmund Ashworth." Helena's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She gripped the kitchen counter for support, her mind racing through the implications. What sort of test results? "Blood type and genetic marker information. Apparently for a family medical history project. The request seems legitimate, but our policy requires confirmation from the immediate family before releasing any records." "I'll need to discuss this with my husband," Helena managed to say. "Can you delay any release until we've had a chance to review the request?" "The request isn't urgent, so we can hold it for several weeks if necessary." After ending the call, Helena stood in the empty kitchen, her mind working furiously. Edmund's sudden interest in family medical records could only mean one thing. Someone had contacted him with information about his true parentage. But who, and how much did they know? Helena's first instinct was to call Margaret, but she realized that her sister's legal expertise wouldn't help with this particular crisis. She needed information, and she needed it quickly. That afternoon, Helena drove to the village library and used their computers to research Edmund Ashworth. Charles's younger brother had always been something of a black sheep, choosing to live quietly in the Scottish Highlands rather than embrace the aristocratic lifestyle his birth had afforded him. He worked as a wildlife photographer and lived in a modest cottage with his partner, a local artist named David Mackenzie. But according to recent social media posts, Edmund had been asking questions about family history and had hired a professional genealogist to trace the Ashworth lineage. One post from 3 weeks earlier showed him holding an old photograph of their father, with a caption that read, "Starting to understand why I never felt like I quite belonged in the family portraits." Helena felt a chill of recognition. Someone had approached Edmund with enough information to make him suspicious about his parentage, but probably not enough to prove anything definitively. That would explain his sudden interest in medical records and genetic information. The question was whether Helena could neutralize this threat before it destroyed everything she had worked to preserve. That evening, Helena waited until Charles had retired to his study before making a series of careful phone calls. The first was to a private investigator in Edinburgh, a man whose services she had researched but never expected to need. "I need information about my brother-in-law," she explained after establishing the investigator's credentials and payment terms. "Someone has apparently approached him with questions about his family history, and I need to know who and why." The investigator, a former police detective named Morrison, assured her that he could have preliminary information within 48 hours. His rates were expensive, but Helena had access to funds that Charles knew nothing about, money she had carefully accumulated over the years as insurance against exactly this type of crisis. Her second call was to Margaret, despite her earlier reservations. "I need to know what would happen if someone challenged Charles's legitimacy with incomplete evidence," Helena said without preamble. "Helena, what's happened?" "Edmund is asking questions. Someone has given him enough information to make him suspicious, but I don't think he has the complete picture yet." Helena kept her voice low, conscious that sound traveled strangely through the manor's old walls. "If he petitions for genetic testing, what are the legal implications?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "If there's a formal challenge to Charles's legitimacy, it would trigger a comprehensive investigation through the College of Arms and possibly the House of Lords. Blood samples would be required from multiple family members, and any existing genetic evidence would be examined by court-appointed experts. How long would such a process take? Months, possibly years. These matters are taken very seriously, and the courts would want to be absolutely certain of their findings before overturning centuries of established inheritance." Helena processed this information carefully. A formal challenge would create a lengthy legal battle that would consume vast amounts of money and generate enormous publicity. Even if Edmund ultimately failed to prove his case, the scandal would destroy what remained of the family's reputation and financial stability. "There's something else," Margaret continued reluctantly. "If Charles's legitimacy is successfully challenged, any financial decisions he's made as Duke could be called into question. Creditors could potentially challenge the estate's debt obligations, and the inheritance tax situation would become infinitely more complex." The implications were staggering. A successful challenge wouldn't just strip Charles of his title, it could potentially invalidate every legal decision he had made since inheriting the dukedom. The resulting legal chaos could take years to sort out, during which time the estate would be frozen and its assets tied up in court proceedings. Helena thanked her sister and ended the call, her mind racing through possible scenarios and counter-moves. She had perhaps a few weeks before Edmund made his move, assuming that's what he was planning. The question was whether she could find a way to neutralize the threat without revealing her own involvement in concealing the truth. 2 days later, Morrison called with his preliminary report. "Your brother-in-law was contacted 3 weeks ago by a woman claiming to be the daughter of Thomas Mitchell, apparently the man who may have been his biological father. She approached him through social media with some family photographs and suggested there might be more to their family connection than he realized." Helena felt her blood turn to ice. Thomas Mitchell had been the stable master who had an affair with the Duchess 45 years earlier. She had assumed he was long dead, but apparently he had children who were now asking their own questions about the past. "What does this woman know?" Helena asked. "Not much, according to my sources. She has some old letters and photographs that suggest her father had a relationship with the Duchess, but nothing definitive. She seems to be fishing for information rather than making accusations. And Edmund, he's intrigued but cautious. He's hired a genealogist to investigate the family history, but he hasn't made any formal moves yet. My impression is that he's still trying to decide whether to pursue the matter." Helena thanked Morrison and arranged for him to continue monitoring the situation. She now had a clearer picture of the threat, but also a potential opportunity. If Thomas Mitchell's daughter was the source of Edmund's suspicions, then neutralizing her influence might be enough to discourage further investigation. That afternoon, Helena made a decision that she knew would fundamentally change the nature of her relationship with Charles and her role in the family. She retrieved the original documents from her London safety deposit box and spread them across her bedroom floor, studying them with the intensity of a general planning a decisive battle. The DNA test results were unambiguous. Charles was not the biological son of the late Duke. The private investigator reports detailed the Duchess's affair with Thomas Mitchell and her subsequent efforts to cover it up. Most damning of all were the financial records showing regular payments to Mitchell and several other potential witnesses, payments that had continued for over 4 decades. Helena photographed everything once again, creating multiple copies that she stored in different locations. Then she made a phone call that would either save her family or destroy it. "Miss Mitchell, this is Helena Ashworth, the Duchess of Ashworth. I understand you've been in contact with my brother-in-law about your father's connection to our family." The young woman on the other end of the line was clearly surprised to be contacted directly by a member of the family she had been investigating. "Your Grace, I? Yes. I've been trying to understand my father's relationship with your mother-in-law. He kept some letters and photographs that suggested they were quite close. Miss Mitchell, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your father and the Duchess. There are things about their relationship that I believe you have a right to know, and questions that have been troubling my family for many years. Helena arranged to meet with Sarah Mitchell the following week in London, ostensibly to share information about the historical connection between their families. But Helena's true purpose was far more complex. She intended to give Sarah Mitchell exactly what she was looking for, complete with documentation that would prove her father's relationship with the Duchess and its consequences. But Helena would present this information in a way that served her own purposes, positioning herself as a concerned family member who had discovered troubling secrets and felt morally obligated to reveal the truth. She would suggest that Charles himself was unaware of his true parentage, painting him as an innocent victim of his mother's deceptions. Most importantly, she would propose a solution that would allow both families to benefit from the truth, while minimizing the public scandal and legal complications. As Helena prepared for what might be the most important negotiation of her life, she reflected on how far she had traveled from the innocent young woman who had married into the Ashworth family 15 years earlier. The idealistic girl who had dreamed of fairy tale romance would be horrified by the calculating woman she had become. But survival had required adaptation, and Helena had proven herself remarkably adaptable. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of aristocratic society, to manage complex financial pressures, and to protect secrets that could destroy everything she had worked to build. Now she faced the ultimate test of her abilities. In the coming days, she would either secure her family's future or watch everything they had built crumble into ruins. The game that had begun with missing jewelry was about to reach its climax, and Helena intended to emerge victorious regardless of the cost. The morning of her meeting with Sarah Mitchell, Helena stood once again at her bedroom window, looking out over the estate grounds that had become both her kingdom and her battlefield. In a few hours, she would either save the Ashworth legacy or orchestrate its complete transformation. Either way, she would finally be free of the Duchess's shadow and able to shape her family's destiny according to her own vision. The secrets that had once threatened to destroy her would become the foundation of a new kind of power, one that she alone controlled. Helena smiled as she gathered her documents and prepared to leave for London. The game was entering its final phase, and she held all the winning cards.